Few experiences are as profoundly transformative, perhaps even revolutionary, as the moment when someone finally decides they're done. Not out of bitterness or carelessness, but from a place of conscious, firm resolve. This moment is not fueled by anger or revenge. It is fueled by clarity. Empathy is often misunderstood in our culture. It's typically portrayed as softness, as a form of gentle acquiescence to the emotional needs of others. And while empathy does involve a deep capacity to understand and resonate with another person's emotions, that capacity doesn't imply weakness. In fact, true empathy is one of the most powerful traits a human being can possess because it requires courage, discipline, and extraordinary self-awareness. When we talk about empathy in the context of narcissistic dynamics, we're not talking about a superficial trait. We're talking about someone who can feel deeply, someone who can understand not just what another person is expressing on the surface, but what they are really experiencing underneath. An empath doesn't just hear words, they perceive meaning. They sense patterns, emotions, motives. This is a form of psychological intuition that many mistake for emotional vulnerability. But it isn't vulnerability, not inherently. It's insight, it's intelligence wrapped in compassion. Now here's where the dynamic becomes particularly interesting. Narcissists, by their nature, are not interested in mutual understanding. They are not operating on the same emotional frequency. Their world is constructed around control, attention, and ego preservation. To them, the empath is not a person. They're a resource, a mirror, a tool that reflects back the validation the narcissist craves. So when an empath enters their life, it feels like a perfect match. On the surface, the narcissist thrives on admiration, and the empath is naturally inclined to give support, to nurture, to understand. But underneath this dynamic lies a dangerous imbalance. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And that's where the distinction lies. An empath who has not yet awakened to their own power, to their own right to say no, becomes easy prey to narcissistic manipulation. Their compassion gets weaponized against them. Their desire to help becomes a leash around their soul. They start to doubt themselves. They begin to internalize the narcissist's narrative. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. This gaslighting corrodes the empath's sense of reality. They try harder. They give more. They sacrifice themselves to preserve the illusion of connection. But here's the truth that changes everything. Empathy is only powerful when it is conscious, when it is aware of its own worth, when it is no longer operating on autopilot, trying to earn love or fix the unfixable. That is when empathy transforms from passive sensitivity into active strength. It becomes selective, discerning, intentional. And that's what makes it dangerous to the narcissist. Because a self-aware empath begins to see through the narcissist game. They stop reacting emotionally to every manipulation. They stop explaining themselves, justifying themselves, defending their reality. They stop carrying the guilt that was never theirs. And most importantly, they stop trying to save someone who does not want to be saved. They realize that compassion does not mean martyrdom, that love without respect is not love. It's servitude, and they begin to redirect that empathy inward toward themselves. That is the moment when everything changes, when empathy evolves from reactive caregiving into empowered sovereignty. And that shift is terrifying to the narcissist because the empath is no longer a predictable source of supply. They no longer soothe the narcissist's wounds or validate their inflated self-immune. They become unpredictable, calm, silent, detached. And in the narcissist world, that's the ultimate threat. Because the narcissist cannot control someone who is no longer emotionally entangled with them. Empathy at its highest form requires strength. It requires the strength to feel everything, without losing yourself in the process, to see clearly without denying the truth, to care deeply without surrendering your boundaries. This kind of empathy is forged in fire. It's earned through pain. It doesn't come from naivety or passivity. It comes from walking through the dark night of emotional abuse and coming out the other side with your identity intact. Narcissists operate from a fundamentally different psychological framework than most people understand. At their core, they are driven not by logic or reason, but by emotional manipulation and control. They create a world in which they are the center, the authority, and the victim all at once. To maintain this illusion, they must surround themselves with people who reflect back their desired image. People who validate them continuously. People who comply emotionally. That's the foundation of their power. Not truth, not reason, but compliance. And that compliance is emotional, not intellectual. You cannot argue with a narcissist and win. Because the argument is never really about the topic at hand. It's about control. It's about shifting blame, about distorting reality to maintain their sense of superiority or victimhood. They don't debate to understand, they debate to dominate. They don't listen to hear, they listen to gather ammunition. In these dynamics, logic becomes irrelevant. You can present the clearest facts, the most reasonable explanations, and it will all be twisted, deflected, or ignored, because what the narcissist fears most is not your facts, it's your emotional independence. This is why empaths are so valuable to them. An empath brings not only deep emotional attunement, but also a willingness to see the best in others, to give the benefit of the doubt, to empathize even when it hurts. That is a gift in healthy relationships. But in a relationship with a narcissist, it becomes the very thing used against the empath. The narcissist senses this early on. They test it. They see how much the empath will tolerate, how quickly they apologize, how far they'll bend. And once they realize that emotional compliance is available, they exploit it fully. Over time, the empath is drawn into a cycle of emotional confusion. They find themselves defending actions they never took, apologizing for reactions they never had, and questioning their own memories. They begin to doubt their instincts, their perceptions, even their identity. This erosion of self is not accidental. It is the narcissist's unspoken strategy. The more emotionally unstable and uncertain the empath becomes, the more power the narcissist has. It's not about logic. It never was. It's about keeping the empath emotionally entangled, perpetually off balance. That's the key. Narcissists do not want to resolve conflict. They want to perpetuate it not openly, but covertly. They want just enough chaos to keep the empath reactive, emotionally invested, and constantly trying to fix things. The more the empath invests emotionally, the more the narcissist feeds off of that energy, and the more they escalate behaviors. Gaslighting, projection, blame shifting, the more the empath tries to understand, tries to soothe, tries to explain. But again, the narcissist isn't looking for understanding. They are looking for submission. They're looking for control masked as conversation. Many empaths are intelligent, thoughtful, even highly self-aware. But intelligence doesn't protect against emotional entrapment. Because the trap isn't laid in logic, it's laid in emotional conditioning. The narcissist conditions the empath to associate peace with compliance, love with self-sacrifice, and connection with chaos. Over time, the empath begins to anticipate the narcissist's reactions. They edit their words, their tone, even their behavior to avoid conflict. And in doing so, they slowly lose touch with their own emotional reality. The narcissist has succeeded not by winning an argument, but by creating a world where the empath doubts their right to feel what they feel. This emotional dependency is precisely why narcissists can maintain control even when their logic is obviously flawed. They don't have to be right. They just have to make the empath feel wrong. They don't have to tell the truth. They just have to make the empath feel guilty. The moment the empath accepts the role of emotional caretaker in a one-sided relationship, the narcissist has all the power they need because they're not relying on truth. They're relying on emotional reflexes, on guilt, on hope, on fear. The only way to break this cycle is not through explanation, not through confrontation, not even through evidence. It's through emotional detachment. Because when the empath no longer feels the need to prove, to explain, to please, the narcissist's tactics lose their grip. That is the point at which the game begins to fall apart. The narcissist cannot survive in an emotionally neutral environment. They cannot manipulate a person who is no longer reacting. They cannot dominate someone who no longer internalizes their chaos. Boundaries are often misunderstood, especially by those who have spent their lives prioritizing the emotions and needs of others. For an empath, the idea of setting a boundary can initially feel like a betrayal of their core values: compassion, openness, and connection. But in reality, boundaries are not walls that keep people out. They are the lines that define where the self begins and ends. And for an empath, learning to draw those lines is the beginning of awakening to their true power. In relationships with narcissists, boundaries are the first thing to be tested, pushed, and ultimately violated. Narcissists operate through entitlement. They believe they are owed attention, validation, admiration, and control over how others perceive them. When an empath enters the picture, they are often met with charm, affection, and an illusion of emotional intimacy. The narcissist quickly identifies the empath's natural tendencies to care deeply, to listen, and to avoid conflict. These traits are then exploited to slowly dismantle the empath's sense of personal space and identity. The erosion of boundaries in this dynamic is often subtle. It doesn't begin with overt abuse. It begins with small compromises, ignoring a red flag, excusing a cruel comment, allowing a bit of disrespect because they're just having a bad day. The empath rationalizes these moments because they believe in growth, in second chances, in understanding the pain of others. But each concession becomes a step away from the self. Over time, the empath finds themselves making excuses for the narcissist's behavior, prioritizing their moods, and sacrificing their own needs to maintain peace. What makes this dynamic so damaging is that it masquerades as love. The narcissist frames the empath's resistance as selfishness, their boundaries as cruelty, their independence as betrayal. They condition the empath to feel guilty for asserting themselves. They twist boundaries into rejection. This emotional inversion keeps the empath stuck in a cycle of self-doubt and overcompensation. The more they try to re-establish themselves, the more resistance they face. It becomes easier to surrender than to fight for clarity. But awakening comes when the empath finally sees the cost of this surrender. When the exhaustion becomes unbearable, when the self-betrayal becomes too loud to ignore, the empath begins to question not only the narcissist, but the entire framework of the relationship. They begin to ask new questions. What do I need? What do I feel? What is no longer acceptable to me? These questions mark the beginning of transformation because they are the foundation upon which boundaries are built. Setting boundaries is not a reaction to the narcissist. It is a declaration of self-worth. It's the moment the empath stops defining themselves by what they give and starts recognizing who they are. A boundary is not about changing the narcissist's behavior. It's about choosing what you will no longer allow in your life. It's not about control. It's about clarity. Clarity about what serves you, what honors you, and what protects your peace. When an empath begins to set boundaries, the narcissist often reacts with fury, confusion, or manipulation. They are not used to resistance. They are not used to hearing no. That word threatens their illusion of control. It disrupts the emotional economy they've created, where the empath gives endlessly, and they take without question. A boundary exposes this imbalance. It forces the narcissist to confront a reality they've spent their lives avoiding, that other people exist as separate, autonomous beings. This confrontation is uncomfortable, and the narcissist will often escalate their behavior to regain control. They may try to guilt-trip the empath, play the victim, or suddenly shift to love bombing in an attempt to restore the previous dynamic. But once the empath has felt the strength of their own boundaries, something irreversible happens. They begin to see the pattern. They start to trust their instincts over the narcissist's narrative. They no longer feel responsible for another person's emotional regulation. And most importantly, they realize they are allowed to take up space, to have needs, to say no without explanation or apology. Boundaries are not just limits. They are declarations of identity. They are the architecture of self-respect. For the empath, they represent a radical shift from external validation to internal alignment. They mark the transition from emotional servitude to personal sovereignty. And while they may initially bring conflict, they ultimately bring clarity, peace, and freedom. Detachment is often misunderstood, especially by those who have been conditioned to associate love with sacrifice, attention with care, and presence with obligation. For empaths, detachment may initially feel cold or even cruel. They are used to being emotionally available, constantly present, and deeply invested in the well-being of others. However, when faced with a narcissistic dynamic, this emotional presence becomes a liability rather than a strength. In the hands of a narcissist, every emotional reaction becomes a point of leverage, every vulnerability an opportunity for control. The more reactive the empath is, the more power the narcissist holds. Narcissists thrive in emotionally charged environments. They rely on confusion, volatility, and intensity to maintain control. The constant highs and lows they create keep the empath in a state of emotional survival, always trying to fix, soothe, or understand. They draw the empath into a psychological game where the rules constantly change and the goalposts endlessly shift. It is not logic that traps the empath, but their own emotional investment. The more they care, the more entangled they become. The more they explain themselves, the deeper they sink. And all the while, the narcissist feeds on the attention, the apologies, the pleas for clarity. In this context, detachment becomes a radical act of self-preservation. It is not an act of indifference, but a decision to stop engaging in a system that is designed to keep them emotionally captive. Detachment is the refusal to participate in manipulation, the refusal to be drawn into false narratives or manufactured crises. It is the moment when the empath stops reacting, stops defending, stops explaining. And this shift dismantles the narcissist's entire strategy. Where once there was argument, there is now silence. Where once there was justification, there is now stillness. The narcissist is no longer receiving the emotional feedback they rely on to feel powerful and in control. They may escalate, provoke, or even beg to regain that dynamic, but detachment is not easily reversed once it is truly embraced. The empath no longer needs to win the argument, clarify the misunderstanding, or earn the narcissist's approval. They understand that there is nothing to prove and nothing to fix. The game only continues as long as they choose to play. Detachment also reveals the emotional patterns that were previously invisible. From the outside, it becomes clear how predictable the narcissist's tactics really are. The cycles of love bombing, devaluation, and discard lose their mystique. The promises and apologies begin to sound like scripts. The charm no longer feels genuine. And perhaps most powerfully, the empath realizes that they no longer need to decipher or decode the narcissist's behavior. They begin to understand that it is not their responsibility to understand or carry someone else's dysfunction. This realization is deeply liberating. It allows the empath to reclaim their emotional energy and redirect it inward. Instead of investing in someone else's healing, they begin to invest in their own. They develop new boundaries, rediscover forgotten interests, and reconnect with their inner voice. Detachment creates space for reflection, for truth, and for clarity. It is in that space that the empath begins to feel a sense of peace they may not have known was possible. The narcissist, on the other hand, is destabilized by this change. They are no longer the center of attention. They no longer have control over the empath's emotions. They may respond with rage, desperation, or even calculated charm to reestablish the connection. But the empath now, grounded in detachment, sees through these efforts. They no longer feel the need to rescue, to absorb, or to engage. Their sense of self is no longer tied to the narcissist's approval or rejection. Detachment does not mean a lack of empathy. It means recognizing that empathy can exist without emotional entanglement. It is the awareness that you can care about someone without sacrificing your well-being. It is the understanding that love, if it requires the destruction of the self, is not love at all. For the empath, detachment is a return to emotional sovereignty. It is the process of stepping out of the narcissist's shadow and back into the light of their own truth. Healing is not just about moving on. It's about reclaiming parts of yourself that were lost in the process of trying to love someone who could not or would not reciprocate in a healthy way. For the empath who has endured a relationship with a narcissist, healing becomes a revolutionary act. It is the gradual unraveling of all the false beliefs that were instilled through manipulation, emotional abuse, and psychological control. It's the slow, painful process of remembering who you were before your identity was shaped around another person's dysfunction. Narcissists operate through control, not just overt control like telling someone what to do, but subtle, insidious control that chips away at self-trust and autonomy. They rewrite reality through gaslighting, distort the narrative through projection, and reframe their cruelty as your fault. Over time, the empath internalizes these distortions. They begin to question their own motives, doubt their memory, and suppress their emotions. They adapt to survive, often losing the ability to differentiate between love and obligation, kindness and compliance, compassion and codependence. But when the empath steps away from the relationship, physically or emotionally, the healing process begins to illuminate all that was hidden in plain sight. Patterns that once seemed confusing start to make sense. The cycles of abuse that were normalized begin to look grotesque in retrospect. The constant emotional exhaustion, the hypervigilance, the chronic guilt, all start to connect. The empath begins to see that the problem was never their love, but the lack of mutual respect and reciprocity. They realize that being emotionally generous in a one-sided dynamic is not noble. It's self-destructive. Healing breaks the narcissist's psychological hold because it signifies a complete withdrawal from the game they were playing. The narcissist thrives on attention, emotional reactions, and the ability to influence how others feel and behave. When the empath begins to heal, they stop providing that fuel. They stop answering the late-night messages, stop explaining themselves, stop seeking closure from someone who was never capable of giving it. They stop needing the narcissist to validate their experience or acknowledge the harm done. This shift is devastating to the narcissist because it disrupts the illusion of control. They can no longer reach into the empath's emotional world and stir chaos. The empath is no longer available to be triggered, manipulated, or guilt-tripped. And because narcissists rarely self-reflect, they often interpret this emotional unavailability as betrayal or punishment, never realizing that it is actually self-preservation. The empath is not playing hard to get. They are truly gone emotionally and spiritually. As the empath heals, they begin to rebuild their identity. They learn to listen to their inner voice again. They practice saying no without guilt. They reclaim joy, solitude, strength, and boundaries. They start to form new connections, ones based on mutual respect and emotional safety. Their world becomes less about surviving and more about living. The scars remain, but they no longer define the empath's sense of self. They serve as reminders of resilience, not of failure. In this process, the empath also comes to understand that healing is not linear. There are moments of clarity followed by moments of grief. There are days when the weight of the past feels overwhelming, and days when freedom feels exhilarating. But each step, no matter how small, is a movement toward wholeness. And with each step, the narcissist's influence fades. Their voice, once so loud in the empath's mind, begins to lose power. Their opinions no longer dictate self-worth. Their approval no longer feels necessary. Healing also brings about a new level of discernment. The empath becomes better equipped to recognize red flags, to trust their intuition, and to walk away from dynamics that feel familiar in unhealthy ways. They no longer mistake chaos for passion or manipulation for love. They learn to distinguish between emotional availability and emotional dependency. They choose peace over intensity, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over temporary validation. This evolution is irreversible. Once the empath sees the truth, they cannot unsee it. Once they taste the strength of self-trust, they cannot go back to self-abandonment. The narcissist who once held so much psychological influence becomes just another person with no power over their emotions or identity. Healing transforms the empath from a source of supply into a sovereign being, someone who has reclaimed their autonomy, their voice, and their life. There comes a moment in every empath's journey when the silence speaks louder than words, when the absence of reaction becomes the most powerful response. That moment, the moment of walking away without explanation, without pleading, without one last conversation, is the beginning of true liberation. For the narcissist, this silence is incomprehensible. They are accustomed to chaos, to drama, to emotionally charged exits that leave the door open for re-entry. They expect the empath to cry, to beg, to explain themselves one more time. But when the empath has truly had enough, there is no show, no final scene, only a quiet exit that carries more weight than any confrontation ever could. Narcissists operate within cycles, and those cycles are predictable. Idealize, devalue, discard, hoover. This pattern is not random. It's engineered. Each phase keeps the empath entangled, hoping that this time it will be different, that this time they will be understood. The narcissist knows how to bait that hope, how to offer just enough validation to keep the empath emotionally invested. But once the empath awakens to the cycle, once they stop hoping, stop trying, stop explaining, they break the loop. And nothing threatens the narcissist more than a loop that cannot close. Walking away is not just physical distance. It's emotional and psychological separation. It's no longer needing closure, no longer analyzing the narcissist's behavior, no longer taking responsibility for their dysfunction. It's not an act of bitterness, but of clarity. The empath has finally realized that nothing will change. that no apology will be sincere, that no explanation will ever make the abuse make sense. They stop seeking understanding from a person who was never interested in being understood. And in doing so, they reclaim their peace. This kind of departure hits differently. Narcissists thrive on unfinished business. They like the door cracked open, a thread they can pull on later. But when the empath walks away clean, when they disengage entirely and without emotion, it sends a message the narcissist cannot manipulate. I see you. I understand. And I'm done. There's nothing left to debate. No emotional leverage left to exploit. The narcissist who once thrived on the empath's reactions now finds themselves standing in silence, powerless. The power in this moment does not come from revenge or superiority. It comes from healing. The empath no longer walks away out of desperation or pain. They walk away because they've reconnected with their own value. They no longer need to prove that they were mistreated, no longer need the narcissist to acknowledge their pain. They understand that the narcissist's inability to love was never a reflection of their worth, but of the narcissist's limitation. And once this truth is fully embodied, there is nothing left to say. This silence is not empty, it's full of resolve. Every step away from the narcissist is a step toward freedom. And while the narcissist may attempt to provoke, to hoover, to remind the empath of shared history or imagined loyalty, none of it lands anymore. The empath sees through the tactics. The guilt no longer works. The charm is no longer convincing. The manipulation, once so effective, now looks obvious and desperate. And what once felt like love is now clearly seen as control. The narcissist may spin narratives, play the victim, or rally others to question the empath's character. But even that has no power when the empath no longer plays the game. When they walk away without responding, without defending themselves, they choose peace over perception. They understand that no amount of justification will satisfy the narcissist's need for dominance. And in refusing to participate in the performance, they end it. Not with a dramatic curtain drop, but with the quiet strength of someone who knows their worth. To the outside world, it might seem sudden, but for the empath, this departure is the result of countless moments of betrayal, of swallowed pain, of overlooked red flags. It's the culmination of years of internal conflict, of trying to make it work, of hoping for change. And when that final line is crossed, the decision is already made. There is no anger left, only certainty. This kind of silence is deafening to the narcissist. It reflects a kind of power they do not understand, a power that does not scream, does not chase, does not beg. It simply exits and never looks back. And in that exit, the empath is reborn. They are no longer the person who once endured, who once tolerated, who once explained. They are someone new, someone whole, someone free, someone who finally knows that walking away is not weakness, but the highest form of strength.